Ghana's legislators have rejected one of the key pillars of a deal with the IMF that earned that country a near $1 billion bailout deal. Lawmakers have passed the Bank of Ghana Amendment Bill that allows the central banks to still finance the government's budget deficit to a limit of up to 5% of the previous year's audited revenue. But the IMF is demanding that that shouldn't happen at all. It's a condition that Ghana has to meet if it wants to receive its next tranche of aid as part of that $1 billion package. However, the executive says despite the new law, it will not be financing its fiscal deficit by cash printed by the central bank. The 3-year IMF program is meant to help Ghana fix its economy, which is dogged by high public debt. Let's figure out exactly where we go from here. Daniel Ranges is live in Washington, D.C. He's been following this story fairly keenly. Daniel, good to see you. Has there been a formal reaction to this parliamentary vote in Ghana from the IMF?
Yes, in the last few minutes we've had a formal response from the IMF to CCTV Global Business Africa. It points out that this deal, as you were outlining, includes the requirement that the central bank stop funding budget deficits in Ghana. And I'll just point out to viewers that this is fairly standard economic thinking, that if you're in an economy where inflation has become a problem, the central bank putting money into the economy is only going to worsen that over time, and that the effects that you want to achieve could be counterproductive. Now, up until this point, the IMF in this statement points out that Ghana has been making encouraging progress since the beginning of 2016 by having no central bank payments go into helping the budget deficit, and that it's encouraged by that. On top of that, it points out that this is a key part of the credibility and effectiveness of their inflation targeting framework, and that the IMF staff will now discuss this with the Ghanaian officials about the possible implications of this law moving forward. And so I think that they are going to be taking a very hard look at the intentions of the Ghanaian government and what implications this law might have on the deal that they reached last year.
Indeed. Given the breach, though, what's likely to happen next? I mean, at face value, isn't this likely to essentially stop the disbursement of the next tranche of this near $1 billion deal?
Well, it's my understanding, and I could be corrected, that they haven't in fact breached the deal because there's a difference between what the legislature might put forward as tools that they think are appropriate for their own sovereign needs and what the executive branch actually does with those tools. So at the moment we've seen no evidence that the executive branch has decided to take them up, as it were, on the offer of using central bank funding to bridge some of these the government deficits. So I think that's why the talks between the IMF and the Ghanaian authorities will now be the central focus to see if they are tempted to use those tools or not. And as you were pointing out earlier, it looks as though the executive branch, the finance ministry in particular, is minded not to use those tools, and that it won't be taking up the legislature on the new rules that it has in place for that funding. That being said, there is tremendous amount of pressure on the government at the moment, given that we've got an election cycle, given the pressures to increase funding, increase spending, and the fact that at the moment, as it has been for several months, the cost of private sector financing, particularly Eurobond financing, that the Ghanaians have been looking to achieve is very costly for them, well over 10% yields at the moment. So it is going to be a difficult, challenging time, but I think the IMF wants to stay engaged on this and continue to recommend the measures that it's put in place.
Indeed, we'll see how Ghana can essentially walk the straight and narrow path of fiscal austerity. Thanks for that. That's Daniel Ranges live in Washington.